The day my son opened his eyes after the coma, my mother brought cake. Not for him, not for me. For my brother's birthday dinner, the one she nearly disowned me over when I refused to leave the ICU. While I sat beside my unconscious child praying he'd survive, she was ordering frosting and threatening to cut us off. My name is Rachel. I'm a single mother, a widow, and for most of my life the forgotten child in a perfect-looking family. This isn't just a story about a selfish parent. It's about the moment I stopped begging to be chosen and chose myself instead. Stay with me. Because this isn't just about cake. It's about how far a mother will go to protect her child, even if it means walking away from her own. The hum of machines had become the soundtrack of my soul, constant, cold, clinical. Every beep from the monitor next to Eli's hospital bed felt like it pulled a thread from my chest, anchoring me to this narrow, sterile room that reeked of antiseptic and fear. I had been here for 72 hours. I hadn't left, not for a shower, not for sleep, not for anything. The nurses brought me lukewarm coffee and reminded me to blink, to breathe, to eat. I did none of those things unless prompted. My entire focus was on my 12-year-old son, who hadn't opened his eyes since the accident. Eli had always been energy in motion, a burst of light and laughter, who asked endless questions and talked with his hands. That morning I had packed him a peanut butter sandwich, reminded him to wear his helmet, and kissed the crown of his messy hair as he raced out the door to meet his friends. I watched from our third-floor apartment window as he waved back one last time, wobbled slightly on his bike, and disappeared down the street. I didn't know it then, but that was the final moment of our ordinary life. The first call came hours later from a stranger's number. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. A paramedic, I think. Though the words blurred into a cold panic. Bike accident, car veered off trail, severe trauma, ICU. I barely remember the drive to Hartford General. I just remember the shrieking silence once I arrived, the blur of forms to sign, and the sudden helplessness of watching my only child disappear behind a pair of double doors. Since then I hadn't moved more than 10 feet from his bedside. I watched the machines breathe for him, watched his tiny chest rise and fall under blankets that smelled like bleach. I stroked his arm, whispered stories, and held his hand, hoping to anchor him here. And then my phone buzzed. Not the hospital, not the neurologist, not another nurse with a grim update. It was my mother. The caller ID didn't show her name. Judith never saved herself in my phone. But I recognized the number from memory, a sequence burned into my mind, like every word of disapproval she'd ever spoken. I answered out of habit, still hoping on some absurd level that she was finally calling to ask how Eli was. "Rachel," she said, her voice sharp and brisk as always. "We need you home tomorrow afternoon. Brian's birthday dinner is at 6, but we'll start prepping around 2. At first I thought she must have forgotten. Or maybe she hadn't heard how serious Eli's condition was. Surely she couldn't be calling about a party while her grandson lay in a medically induced coma. "Mom," I steadied my voice. "Eli is in critical condition. He's unconscious. I haven't left the hospital since the accident." Silence. Just a breath. Then, "Well, the doctors are handling things, aren't they? What exactly are you doing there? Just sitting around? Brian's birthday is important. He only turns 25 once." I stared at the floor, unable to speak. My son might never walk again. He might never speak again. I hadn't even had the courage to ask the neurologist what permanent damage might mean. And my mother was worried about hors d'oeuvres. "Mom," I managed. "He's in a coma. They had to relieve pressure on his brain. I'm not going anywhere." "You always make things so dramatic, Rachel," she snapped. "This is family. You showing up late or not at all would reflect poorly on all of us." I felt something snap. A nerve, maybe. Or a tether I didn't know was holding me hostage. "My son is family." I said, every syllable deliberate. "I'm aware," she replied coolly. "But your presence isn't going to heal him. And Brian deserves support too. For once, could you think about someone other than yourself?" The words stung more than they should have. The implication that I was selfish, dramatic, neglectful, none of it was new. I'd spent my entire life absorbing that message, but this time it landed differently. And then came the final blow. "If you choose to ignore your obligations, Don't expect us to continue supporting you financially. That includes Eli's college fund. If this is how you treat family, maybe it's time we reevaluate everything. I stood stepping just outside Eli's room so I wouldn't scream. My legs trembled as I looked back through the glass window and saw my son, pale, still fighting for his life. For 35 years I said, my voice shaking, but low, I have bent myself into every shape imaginable trying to make you proud. I married someone you disapproved of. I raised a child with no help. I've smiled through every comment, swallowed every judgment. And now, while my son might die, you're worried about centerpieces and party favors. There was a beat of silence. Then, in that familiar, icy tone, if you hang up this phone, Rachel, we are done. And just like that, I hung up. I stood in the hallway, my pulse roaring in my ears, and stared at the screen. Judith. The name I had once saved as Mom had long since reverted to just the digits. My thumb hovered for a moment, then I deleted the contact. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a click, and suddenly a lifetime of guilt began to dissolve. I walked back into the room. Eli looked the same, a fragile sculpture of the boy I loved held together by tape tubes and quiet prayers. I sat back down beside him and took his hand, careful not to disturb the IV lines. His skin was cool but alive, and I leaned in close. I'm right here, sweetheart, I whispered. And I'm not going anywhere. Not for anyone. For the first time in my life, I had chosen something over my mother's expectations. I had chosen us. And somehow, in the middle of all that grief and fear, that choice gave me strength I didn't know I still had. Long before the hospital walls, before the hiss of Eli's ventilator became the pulse of my days, there was Connecticut. A house with white shutters and a mailbox shaped like a goose. The kind of suburb where everyone trimmed their hedges to the same height and waved to each other from driveways that all looked the same. From the outside, we looked like the perfect family, and maybe in some ways we were. Dad, or Frank as everyone else called him, was a senior partner at a tax firm in downtown Hartford. My mother, Judith, ran the PTA like a military operation and volunteered at every church event that needed a microphone or a clipboard. And then there was Brian, my younger brother, the family's pride and joy. Brian was everything Judith ever wanted in a child. Charming, smart, photogenic. He played the piano by ear, won spelling bees without studying, and somehow always managed to smile just the right amount in school photos. By the time we were in middle school, our roles had already solidified. He was the star, and I was the stage crew. It's strange the things you remember when you start putting your own life back together. Not the obvious stuff like birthday parties or school dances. It's the quieter moments. Like the way my mother's face lit up when Brian brought home a trophy. Even a participation ribbon from Little League got a spot on the mantel. My own soccer medals were quietly placed in a drawer. Good job, honey, she'd say with a pat, but her eyes would already be drifting past me to the next thing she expected of me. And it was never enough. Perfection was the minimum standard in our house. The floors were always waxed. The fruit bowl was arranged by color and emotions. Well, those were considered weaknesses, unless they were performance-ready for guests. I remember once in 6th grade I brought home a report card with all A's and a single B+ in math. I was so proud. I had worked hard for that B+, but Judith scanned the sheet and sighed like it was a funeral notice. You know, Brian got straight A's in 6th grade, she said, folding the paper in half before handing it back to me. Maybe he can help you study. That was her version of love. Measured, conditional, always just out of reach. It wasn't that I was a bad kid. I kept my room clean. I volunteered at the church bake sales. I stayed out of trouble. But I wasn't Brian. I wasn't naturally talented or effortlessly charismatic. I was careful, observant, always watching for signs of approval, like breadcrumbs I could follow to safety. But they rarely came. Dad tried in his own way. He was the soft place in that house. The one who would sneak me an extra scoop of ice cream when Judith wasn't watching or whisper, "You're doing great, kiddo," after she left the room. But he never stood up to her. Not once. When she criticized my posture, my clothes, my silence at family dinners, he'd say things like, "Your mother means well," or "She just wants the best for you, Rachel." Maybe he believed that, Or maybe he just didn't want to fight. Judith had a presence that filled every corner of the house, even when she wasn't in the room. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any scream. Sometimes I wonder if she ever realized how much her words shaped me, how deeply her constant comparisons carved themselves into my identity. I didn't just feel unseen, I felt replaceable. Like if I vanished, there'd be no void in the family photo albums. Just one less plate at the table, and maybe even that would be seen as more efficient. In high school, I stopped trying, not in the obvious ways. I still made decent grades, still made curfew. But inside, something hardened. I stopped reaching for her approval. Stopped hoping she'd look at me the way she looked at Brian when he played piano at the church Christmas service. That mix of pride and possession, like he was her finest creation. I knew I would never be that. Instead, I found small spaces to exist that weren't hers. I joined the yearbook committee and took photos of people instead of being in them. I walked dogs at the local shelter just to be around beings who didn't ask me to be anyone else. I found myself through the lens of a camera and the quiet affection of abandoned animals. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Looking back now, sitting in this hospital room with Eli's tiny hand in mine, I realized that those early years taught me something important. Not about love. Judith's love was always contingent on performance, but about resilience, about how to build walls that could bend but not break. Because what no one tells you as a child is that you will carry the weight of your parents' approval, or lack thereof, into every corner of your adulthood. It will echo in your choices, in the relationships you accept, in the way you speak to yourself in the mirror. And when the crisis comes, when life knocks you flat, you will find yourself facing not just the moment, but the entire history of how you were trained to survive it. Judith taught me many things. How to make a place setting with precision. How to smile politely through disappointment. How to prioritize appearances over authenticity. But most of all, she taught me that love could be taken away if you weren't careful. And now, as I sit here beside my unconscious son, I know with every fiber of my being that I will never teach him that. Eli will know that love is not a transaction. He will know that love stays. It was the kind of love that found you quietly. Logan wasn't loud. He wasn't the center of attention in lecture halls or the life of every party. What he was, steadfast, grounded, curious, drew me to him like nothing else had. We met during sophomore year at a late-night study session in the campus library. I was hunched over my laptop dissecting a photography assignment. He sat across from me with engineering blueprints spread across the table and an untouched protein bar beside his notes. I think it was the way he noticed I was cold and handed me his hoodie without a word. Or maybe it was the fact that he asked questions, genuine ones, about what I loved, about the stories I saw through my camera lens, about why I flinched every time someone raised their voice. Logan was attending on an ROTC scholarship, already committed to a future that required sacrifice. While others were planning internships or weekend trips, he talked about basic training, overseas deployments, and how to stay human in the middle of rigid systems. He never asked me to be more than I was, never compared me to anyone. That alone made him feel like a miracle. When I brought him home to meet my parents, Judith's reaction was immediate and blistering. "A soldier," she said, folding her arms in the kitchen like a judge about to deliver a verdict. "You're throwing away your future for a boy who'll be stationed in the middle of nowhere while you raise children alone. I didn't raise you to make these kinds of choices." I know, I had whispered. "You raised me to make your choices." Frank stood quietly by the sink, his mouth pressed into a tight line. He didn't say a word. He rarely did. We married anyway. It was a small wedding, nothing Judith could brag about at church luncheons. No ballroom, no designer gown, just a garden, our closest friends, and 1,000 tiny white lights strung between trees. Judith attended with the air of someone doing a favor, offering critiques masked as comments. "The chairs are a bit close together, don't you think?" Or, "That dress is simple. But I suppose it suits you." She never once looked at Logan the way I did, with faith, with trust, with love. After the ceremony, Frank slipped me an envelope. Inside was a check. On the outside, in his familiar slanted handwriting, it simply said, "I'm proud of you." "Dad?" I held on to that piece of paper for years. Logan and I made a life that didn't revolve around impressing anyone. We lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment where the walls were filled with mismatched picture frames and laughter. I took freelance photography gigs. He cooked on Sundays and always made enough for leftovers. He made Eli's baby food from scratch. We didn't have much, but it felt like everything. When Eli was born, Logan cried, full-on shoulder-shaking tears as he held our son for the first time. "You're here," he whispered to him like he had been waiting forever. Even Judith seemed softer with a baby around. Though of course her kindness came with instructions. "Don't hold him so much, Rachel. You'll spoil him. That pediatrician seems too young. You should take him to Dr. Peterson instead. And always, isn't it time you looked for a real job?" Still we managed. Logan deployed twice. The first time Eli was barely a toddler. I spent those nights curled in our bed staring at the empty side where Logan should have been holding a phone to my chest, like it could bring him back. The second deployment I made him promise he'd be safe. "I'll come home," he told me. "You and Eli are my way back." He didn't keep that promise. Two men in uniform arrived at our door one rainy Tuesday morning. They used phrases like improvised explosive device and immediate fatality. They handed me a folded flag and called him a hero. But the flag didn't keep me warm. It didn't make Eli stop asking why Daddy wasn't answering his bedtime video messages. It didn't help me sleep when I had to explain again and again that Logan wouldn't be coming home. I became a widow at 29, a single mother, a grieving wife who still expected to hear keys in the door every evening. Judith stepped in, at first with casseroles and polite condolences, but slowly, subtly, she began to slip back into her usual role, the critic, the controller. "You should move back home," she told me. "You can't raise a boy alone. Brian and his wife have the space. It just makes sense." I refused. I knew what moving back would mean, surrendering control over my parenting, my home, and worst of all, my voice. So she found other ways to undermine me. She started buying Eli expensive toys, the kinds I couldn't afford. When he opened them, she'd smile sweetly and say, "Mommy doesn't get you things like this, does she?" If I objected, she'd paint me as jealous, ungrateful. She offered to pay for private activities, scheduled them on my weekends, and then accused me of being selfish when I asked her to reschedule. Worse, I began to hear Eli repeat her words. "Grandma says if you'd married someone with a better job, we'd have a house like Uncle Brian." I wanted to scream. Instead, I smiled, nodded, changed the subject, but inside I was breaking. Logan had been the only person who saw all of me. My cracks, my quiet, my fire, and never once asked me to change. He saw value where my family saw fault. And now he was gone. In his absence, I found myself fighting a new war. One not against violence, but against manipulation. Against a mother who believed love was currency and control was care. But I had Eli, and somehow that gave me the strength to keep standing. Because love, the kind Logan gave, the kind I wanted to pass on, didn't demand perfection or payment. It simply stayed. It was a Saturday morning that began with sunlight and cereal. Eli had bounded into the kitchen with a backpack slung across one shoulder and the kind of confidence only a 12-year-old could pull off. "Theo's dad is driving us to the bike trail," he said between bites of cinnamon toast. "We'll be back by 4, promise." I remember asking the usual questions. Helmet, phone, water bottle, and ruffling his hair as he rolled his eyes and grinned at me like I was so overprotective. That was the last moment of our normal life. The call came at 11:27 a.m. I didn't recognize the number, but something inside me knew. There was a tightness in my chest before I even picked up. A woman's voice, calm, rehearsed. "Are you Eli Davis's mother?" There'd been an accident, she explained. A car had veered off the road and onto the bike trail. Eli had been hit. He was unconscious. They were transporting him to Hartford General. I don't remember driving to the hospital. I must have grabbed my keys, locked the door, obeyed traffic signals. But I have no memory of it. My first clear thought was of the emergency department doors parting as I ran inside, screaming his name. "He's in surgery," a nurse told me, gently guiding me to a private consultation room. "They're working on him now." The neurosurgeon will update you soon. The word neurosurgeon should never belong in the same sentence as your child's name. The next hours were a blur of sterile lighting and stillness so heavy it made my bones ache. The doctor arrived 6 hours later, his face grave but focused. "Your son suffered a skull fracture," he began. "There's swelling in the brain. We relieved the pressure, but he's not out of the woods. We've placed him in a medically induced coma." Medically induced coma. It sounded like something from a TV drama, something that happened to other people, not to a child who was laughing over cereal hours earlier. I nodded, scribbled my signature on forms I couldn't comprehend, and waited. They wheeled him into the ICU late that night. Tubes in his arms, wires taped to his skull. His face, bloated, bruised, and terrifyingly still, was nearly unrecognizable. I wasn't prepared for how small he looked in that bed. The first time I touched his hand, I nearly broke. It was warm, soft, but unmoving. I whispered to him anyway, about his robot kits at home, about the vacation we'd been planning for spring break, about how Daddy would be so proud of how brave he was. I stayed by his side and didn't move, not for food, not for sleep. Nurses brought me water bottles and tissues and offered warm blankets I didn't remember asking for. It was Mara, the night nurse, who first started sitting with me when the grief threatened to pull me under. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. She just sat. Sometimes handed me tea. Sometimes rubbed my shoulder. "You're doing everything right," she whispered once when I was sobbing quietly into the crook of my arm. "How do you know?" I asked, broken. "Because you're here," she said. And that's everything. Dr. Nguyen was the attending physician on rotation that weekend. Young but calm, he carried himself with quiet certainty. He explained everything without condescension. Eli's swelling, the sedation schedule, the plan for monitoring neurological signs. He never offered false hope, but he never took mine away either. I didn't cry when they explained the coma, or when they inserted the breathing tube. I didn't cry when I called Frank. But I cried when I realized Judith hadn't even called. No text, no voicemail. Not even a message passed through my father. When Frank arrived the next morning with a bag of fruit and awkward concern, he stood at the doorway like a guest instead of a grandfather. "I told your mother," he said softly, "but she's got something at church this morning. She sends her prayers." Her prayers. I wanted to throw something, a scream at the top of my lungs, but I didn't. I just nodded and turned back to Eli because there was no space left inside me for anything but him. Frank sat with us for 20 minutes. He didn't ask about the details. He didn't stay long. Mara stayed longer. Theo's parents came by. They brought clothes and snacks and offered to walk our dog. My coworker Beth dropped off a card signed by my entire office. My friend Jen sent over dinner from my favorite takeout spot. Judith still hadn't called. It was then that I began to see it clearly. What family really meant. Family wasn't who shared your blood. It was who sat beside you when your world was crumbling. It was Mara who made sure I ate soup at midnight and talked me through how to read the monitors. It was Dr. Nguyen who came by during off hours just to check in. It was Beth and Jen and Theo's mom who didn't need me to be perfect or performative or grateful. They just showed up. Judith had raised me to believe that love was something you earned, that devotion was conditional, that my place in a family required proving I deserved it. But here in the quiet chaos of the ICU, surrounded by machines and fear and strangers who cared, something shifted. I started to believe that real family isn't measured by genetics, but by presence, by who stays, by who refuses to look away. And even though my world had turned upside down, even though Eli was still silent and unmoving in that narrow bed, I knew one thing for certain: I would remember these people for the rest of my life. Not because they were required to care, but because they chose to. By the third day, the waiting became a rhythm of its own. The machines kept humming. The monitors kept blinking. Eli remained still. I hadn't truly slept in nearly 70 hours, just closed my eyes in small bursts and snapped awake at every beep, every shift in his numbers. I lived on hospital coffee, bits of granola bars, and pure adrenaline. My world had shrunk to the four walls of that ICU room, to the curve of Eli's hand beneath mine, to the sterile scent of antiseptic and fear. And that's when the phone rang again. I almost didn't answer. My body was so drained, my hands too heavy to even reach for my phone. But then I saw the number. Judith. She hadn't called once since the accident. Not to ask if Eli had survived surgery, not to ask if I was eating, not to ask if I was holding up. But now, here she was. I stepped out into the hallway, careful not to let the door close behind me. Rachel. She began, her voice firm, like she was mid-agenda. I need you to come by tomorrow. Brian's birthday dinner is at 6, and it would mean a lot if you helped with preparations. Around 2 should work. I stood in the quiet corridor staring out at the gray skyline beyond the glass, and for a moment I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I didn't trust my voice not to tremble. Mom, I said finally. Eli is still in a coma. He hasn't moved. The doctors don't know if... My throat caught. I can't leave. Not now. Judith's reply came swiftly, like she'd prepared it. I understand that you're going through something, Rachel, but there's nothing you can do by sitting there. You hovering doesn't change anything. Meanwhile, your brother only turns 25 once. There it was again. That impossible math my mother always did. Emotional equations that always left me with the remainder, always framed to make me feel unreasonable for asking to matter. Mom, I said more firmly. I'm not going. I'm not leaving my son. Her tone cooled. I really hoped you'd be reasonable. Family is about showing up, Rachel. It's about doing your part even when it's hard. We've supported you all these years, and this is how you repay us. My pulse thundered in my ears. I'm not repaying anyone, I said quietly. This isn't a debt. There was a pause. Then came the words I had always feared, but that now sounded strangely hollow. If you don't come tomorrow, Judith said, then you can consider yourself cut off. The college fund, the emergency money, everything. We won't keep supporting someone who can't prioritize family. I could hear the click of her heels in my head, the way she used to pace behind me when I disappointed her. I could imagine her standing by the kitchen counter, arms crossed, waiting for me to beg. But I didn't. I leaned against the wall of the hospital corridor and exhaled. I see, I said. Excuse me, she snapped. I said, I see. I see what matters to you. I see what you value. And if being present for my son, who may never wake up, disqualifies me from your version of family, then maybe I've been trying to belong to the wrong family all along. You are being dramatic again, she hissed. Think of Eli's future, his college, his stability. I am, I said. I'm thinking of what kind of example I want to set for him. And I want him to know that no amount of money is worth betraying the people we love. There was silence on the other end, followed by her final blow. If you hang up this phone, Rachel, you will no longer be our daughter. For a long moment, I didn't say a word. Then calmly and clearly, I said the words I had carried inside me for far too long. I choose Eli. And I ended the call. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just stood there staring at the screen until it went dark. Then I opened my contacts. Judith. I hovered for only a second before I pressed delete. Not out of rage, not even sadness, but clarity. For the first time in my life, I had drawn a line, and it wasn't made of fear or guilt or longing. It was made of love, the kind that stays no matter what. I walked back into Eli's room. Mara was adjusting his blanket, humming something under her breath. She looked up and offered a soft smile. Everything okay? She asked. No, I said. But I think it will be. I sat back down beside Eli and took his hand. I brushed his hair back and leaned in. No matter what happens, I whispered, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. And in that quiet moment, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a different kind of family. One built not on fear, but on love and boundaries and truth. One where my son would grow up knowing that he mattered, and that his mother, finally, believed she did too. The ICU had become my second skin. I knew the rhythm of the machines, the soft hiss of the ventilator, the subtle shift in beeping that meant someone had adjusted a dosage or noted a small change. I had memorized the patterns of Eli's face. Every bruise, every twitch of his eyelids, every millimeter his fingers might move. By the 4th day, the staff had started rotating faces, but I remained the constant. I didn't leave, not even when they brought in cots for parents to rest. I stayed by Eli's side, whispering stories into his ears, clinging to the belief that somewhere in the fog he could still hear me. I told him about the time he built his first Lego bridge and refused to let anyone touch it for a week. About how Daddy used to tuck him in with songs he couldn't sing in tune. About the robot kit waiting for him at home and the trip we'd planned to the Science Museum in Sea. I painted a path for him back to us, one memory at a time. He needs to feel you, Mara had told me gently, even if he can't respond yet. Don't stop being his anchor. And so I stayed. I counted every blink, every breath, every hopeful sign. When the doctors began decreasing the sedation, my heart beat so loudly I was sure Eli could hear it from inside that haze. Then one evening, as the sunset threw stripes of amber across the white hospital tiles, his fingers twitched. At first I thought I imagined it. I leaned closer, holding my breath. Eli, I whispered, brushing my thumb across his knuckles. It's Mom. I'm right here. Nothing. Then, another twitch. This time firmer. Mara caught the movement too. She called Dr. Nguyen immediately. He arrived in minutes, checked Eli's reflexes, watched the monitors, and nodded. He's trying, the doctor said. We're seeing signs of consciousness. This is good. Hours passed in slow, aching increments. I barely moved, afraid to blink, afraid to miss the moment when he might come back. And then just before midnight, his eyelids fluttered. It wasn't much, just a brief quiver, but it was real. By morning, his eyes opened, slowly unfocused, like he was trying to remember how to see. He blinked, turned his head slightly toward me, and his lips parted around the breathing tube. Eli. I choked out, tears already spilling down my cheeks. Can you hear me? He didn't speak. He couldn't. But his eyes met mine, and he nodded. Barely. But it was enough. Later, when the ventilator was finally removed and he rasped his first words, they weren't about what had happened or where he was. They were simple. Quiet. Meant only for me. Were you here the whole time? I smiled through sobs. Every second, baby. I never left. That afternoon, as the medical team adjusted his IVs and assessed his progress, I finally allowed myself to hope, to exhale, to believe that the worst might be behind us. That's when the door opened and Judith walked in. She didn't knock. She never did. Behind her trailed Brian, carrying a bouquet of hydrangeas and a gift bag far too sparkly for a hospital room. Judith's heels clicked against the floor like a gavel. She looked around the room, sniffed, and offered a tight smile. There you are, she said, as if I'd gone missing on purpose. We've been trying to reach you. I glanced at Eli, who had turned his head away, too weak to react. Still, his small hand tensed in mine. I turned my phone off last night, I said quietly. Eli woke up. Judith's gaze flickered to her grandson. Yes, well, that's why we came. Then dropping her voice, she added, we should speak outside. I'm not leaving him, I replied. It's okay, Mom, Eli whispered. I'm okay. Reluctantly, I followed her just beyond the door where Brian lingered awkwardly, clearly caught in the crossfire. Judith wasted no time. Your behavior has been completely unacceptable, Rachel. Missing Brian's birthday, cutting off communication. You embarrassed the entire family. And now you're refusing to let us help. My son almost died, I said flatly. You didn't even come until after he woke up. He's fine now, she snapped. So all that drama wasn't necessary, was it? My body went still. You will not speak about my son's trauma like it was a scheduling inconvenience, I said, voice low and steady. Judith's jaw tightened. You always twist things into a personal attack. Family obligations don't just disappear because you're in crisis. I took a breath. Let me be clear. If you raise your voice, bring stress, or push your opinions in front of Eli ever again, you won't see him again. Not in this hospital. Not after. Brian's eyes widened. Judith blinked. You're serious? I nodded. For the first time in 35 years, I am. She stood there for a moment stunned, then turned sharply and re-entered the room, donning the role of doting grandmother like it was a costume. She patted Eli's hand, told him how brave he was, made sure to mention how busy things had been at home. I watched like a hawk, but Eli, bless his heart, simply turned his head toward me. He didn't need her validation. He had mine. A week after Eli opened his eyes, Judith followed through on her word. Frank called on a Tuesday evening. His voice was quieter than usual, almost rehearsed. Your mother wanted me to let you know, he began, that she's made some adjustments to the trust. Adjustments? The word hung in the air like the echo of a slammed door. What kind of adjustments, I asked, though I already knew. He hesitated. She's removed both you and Eli from the inheritance. She says, actions have consequences. I closed my eyes, letting the words settle into the hollow space that used to crave her approval. And you? I asked gently. Do you agree? There was a long pause. Rachel. You know how your mother is. Yes, I said. I know exactly how she is. He didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't offer a lifeline. And I realized then that neutrality is its own kind of betrayal. Silence isn't safety. It's choosing a side without the courage to name it. That night I cried. Not for the money, but for the finality of it all. For the last piece of hope I didn't even realize I was still carrying. The hope that one day she would change, that she would choose me. But instead, I chose myself. We moved out of our small apartment near the hospital and into a more modest one-bedroom on the east side. It wasn't much, but it was ours. The windows faced the sunrise and the neighbors remembered your name. Eli got the bedroom. I slept on the pull-out in the living room. And for the first time, we had silence that didn't sting. It healed. I returned to work part-time at the school office and picked up freelance photography gigs on the weekends. Small weddings, graduation portraits, pet photo shoots. Nothing glamorous, but honest. Real. I edited at night, sometimes with Eli curled up beside me, his homework on one side, my laptop on the other. We became our own little rhythm. Eli began physical therapy twice a week. His limp softened. His strength returned bit by bit. The first time he ran without stumbling, across a soccer field during recess. He came home grinning and breathless, shouting, "Mom, I didn't fall." We celebrated with frozen pizza and apple juice in wine glasses. At school, he made new friends. He joined the science club again. And slowly the hospital faded into a memory that didn't define him, but informed him. It made him more tender, more aware. He asked questions that other 12-year-olds didn't. Why do some people love with rules, he asked once. I didn't know how to answer that one. But he also began saying things that stopped me in my tracks. Like the night he looked up from his book and said, "Mom, you're the bravest person I know." Brave, I laughed. I cry when we run out of coffee. You stayed, he said simply. Even when it was hard. He was right. I had stayed. Through grief, through gaslighting, through guilt. I had stayed when no one else did. And now, in this quiet, rebuilt life, I was finally learning what it meant to stay with myself. Judith sent a letter once. Just one. It came in a crisp white envelope, her handwriting still as pristine and unfeeling as ever. Inside, a short note filled with passive-aggressive sympathy and barely veiled superiority. I hope you're managing. Brian and his wife are expecting their second child. Blessings come to those who make the right choices. I didn't reply. I didn't even finish reading it. I folded the letter neatly and slid it into a drawer I never opened again. Frank called less often, but sometimes sent small packages. Books for Eli, photos from old family albums. He never said her name again. He never asked to visit, and we never invited him. We weren't angry, just done. Because I had finally learned that peace doesn't always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with release. We no longer had a trust fund, but we had trust. In each other, in our bond, in this small life we were building. We no longer had a large family, but we had a small one that didn't ask us to shrink ourselves to fit. And I no longer had a mother, but I had a child who knew what it meant to be loved without strings. That was enough. That was everything. 1 year later, Eli turned 13. The scar on his temple had faded, though not completely. It curved just past his hairline, a faint reminder of everything we'd survived. He didn't hide it. Didn't seem to notice it most days. But I did. Every time I caught a glimpse of it in the morning light, it brought back the smell of antiseptic, The sound of heart monitors, the cold terror that had lived in my chest for days. But this day felt different. We didn't throw a party with a guest list or a theme. There were no balloons or party favors or extended family trying to pretend like nothing had happened. Instead, we kept it simple. Just a small group in our apartment, a few of Eli's closest friends from school, his physical therapist who had become a family friend, Mara, the nurse who still checked in from time to time, and my coworker Beth who had become like an aunt to him. There was cake homemade and lopsided, pizza on mismatched plates, a playlist of Eli's favorite songs echoing quietly through the living room. He laughed until he hiccuped. He moved freely, still favoring one leg slightly but moving, alive. Frank showed up near the end, as he always did, just after the candles were blown out. He brought a wrapped box and a half smile. "Happy birthday, Eli," he said, placing the gift on the table. "This one's from me." There was no mention of Judith, no apology, no bridge. Just the quiet air of a man caught in a life he never fully took responsibility for. Eli accepted the gift with a polite thank you, then turned back to his friends. Later that night, after everyone had left, and we were cleaning up stray paper plates and crumbs from the carpet, Eli curled up beside me on the pull-out couch where I still slept most nights. "Mom, yeah. Do you think we'll ever see Grandma Judith again?" I didn't answer right away. I looked over at him. His face fuller, older now. His eyes had changed since the accident. They still sparkled, still held mischief, but they also carried something deeper. He knew more about pain than a child should, and love, and choices. I smoothed his hair and took a breath. "Only if she learns how to love the right way," I said. "The kind that doesn't come with guilt or strings. The kind that doesn't make us feel small." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Okay." A pause. "Because I don't need her money," he said, suddenly turning to face me. "Or her presence. I don't need anything from her." I blinked. "No." He shook his head. "I have you. That's all I need." My throat closed. The dishes in the sink could wait. The mess on the floor could wait. I pulled him close and held on like the truth he had just spoken was the one thing anchoring us both. In that moment, I didn't feel like a single mom. I didn't feel like a failure or an outsider or a woman who'd lost everything. I felt whole, because my son loved me, not for what I could provide, or because I checked some invisible box, but because I had shown up, because I had chosen him, and somewhere along the way, he had chosen me back. That night, after he fell asleep on the couch with his arms curled into his chest, I stepped out onto our small balcony. The city lights blinked in the distance. A soft breeze moved through the leaves of the potted plant we were somehow keeping alive. I thought about everything we had lost, and everything we had gained. Judith's money, her house, her place in the community, her version of legacy. It was all gone. But in its place we had this life, this quiet, this safety. And more than that, we had love that didn't ask us to shrink, love that didn't hurt. I used to think freedom meant walking away. Now I know real freedom is when you stop needing permission to stay gone. It doesn't mean you hate them. It doesn't mean you wish them harm. It just means you're finally choosing to belong to yourself. And that's where we are now. Two people rebuilding from the inside out. Not waiting for approval, not pretending anymore. Just living, together. Sometimes healing doesn't come from fixing what's broken. It comes from choosing what's healthy, from setting boundaries, from realizing that walking away isn't giving up. It's starting over. Rachel didn't lose her family. She chose peace. She chose to be the kind of parent she never had. And in doing so, she gave her son a different kind of legacy. Have you ever had to make that kind of choice? Have you ever found strength in letting go of someone who couldn't love you the way you deserved? We would love to hear your story. Leave a comment and let someone else know they're not alone. And if this story resonated with you, take a moment to support what we're building here. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Because every story told is a chance to heal. And sometimes hearing someone else's truth helps you trust your own.